Hello and welcome to yet another module on population studies. Today we are discussing about climate related disasters and displacement. It took one of the world's deadliest disasters, the tsunami of 2004, to bring home to governments and policymakers around the world the need to develop more effective responses to natural disasters and the people uprooted by them. 5 million people were displaced and some 250,000 killed in 11 different countries in Asia and Africa. Even today, 6 years later, reconstruction efforts are ongoing, while the impact on infrastructure, clean water, sanitation, and livelihoods is expected to last for decades. The tsunami was caused by an earthquake, not climate change, but floods, hurricanes, cyclones, landslides, and other sudden onset disasters are expected to become more frequent and severe in the future as a result of climate change. Over the past 2 decades, the number of recorded disasters has doubled from approximately 200 to over 400 per year, and 9 out of 10 disasters have been climate related. The total number of people affected by natural disasters over the past decade has reportedly tripled to 2 billion people, an average of more than 200 million people directly affected each year. The increase in natural disasters is expected to produce massive displacement that will change the world's perception of forcibly displaced people, currently thought of primarily as refugees and internally displaced people, that is IDPs. Uprooted by persecution and conflict, the vast majority will be displaced inside their countries, although significant numbers will cross internationally recognized borders, especially when island states become submerged. Although estimates of the number of those displaced will vary, a 2007 Christian Aid report estimates that between the year 2007 and 2050, climate change related phenomena, that is floods, hurricanes, droughts, will permanently displace 250 million people. The United Nations and the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center IDMC find that while they cannot predict whether the people involved will be permanently or temporarily displaced, in 2008 alone, some 36 million people were uprooted by sudden onset natural disasters, including 20 million displaced by disasters associated with climate change. If one were to add to these numbers those compelled to leave their homes by longer term environmental problems like drought, desertification, rising sea levels, extreme temperatures, deforestation, land degradation, known as slow onset disaster, the total for 2008 would undoubtedly be tens of millions more. The UN IDMC report cites a figure of 26.5 million drought affected persons in 2008, but no overall estimate exists of those displaced by slow onset disasters. Traditionally, migration from such disasters has been perceived as voluntary, but increasingly such movement is also being seen as forced. Indeed, long-standing international definition of forced migrants and the international system of protection for them may have to expand to accommodate the many different patterns of migration emerging. Distinctions between disaster displaced and conflict displaced people may also blur. Climate change will likely fuel armed conflicts, some between states competing for scarce resources, others within states among different ethnic and tribal groups. Darfur, Sudan is but one recent example of how ecological degradation and water scarcity can ignite tensions between competing groups and then turn genocidal. when exacerbated by the manipulations and irresponsible policies of a government like Sudan's. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has warned that violence in Somalia grows from a similarly volatile mix of food and water insecurity. So do the troubles in Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso. Environmental disasters are clearly challenging many of the long-standing conceptual, legal and organizational means of dealing with displacement. The international protection regimes set up for refugees and more recently for internally displaced persons either exclude or fail to focus on environmentally displaced persons, whether these displaced within their own countries by slow onset disasters can be said to fit under the rubric of internally displaced person, and whether those forced to cross borders for environmental reasons will fit under the term refugee or voluntary migrant are open questions. The possible need for new terminology and systems of protection for those displaced by environmental disasters thus requires examination. Protection of the human rights of those uprooted by disaster has received far too little attention, as Jan Egeland, former UN Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and Walter Cullen, representative of the Secretary General on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, that is RSC, have aptly observed. While the international response to natural disasters has become even swifter and more sophisticated in the rush to deliver life-saving aid, little attention has been paid to the rights of those displaced people. Efforts underway have focused on developing preventive and risk reduction strategies, improving rescue actions, accelerating the delivery of relief, and undertaking initiatives to build back better in recovery and reconstruction process. Identifying the human rights concerns of disaster victims and how best to provide them with protection have received less focus. Yet recent disasters have exposed unequal access to food and supplies, in particular by women, discrimination in provision of aid on ethnic, caste, racial, religious, or gender grounds, evacuation plans that discriminate against poor and other vulnerable people, sexual and gender-based violence, especially in camps and shelters, exploitation, trafficking, and military recruitment of separated children, neglect and exploitation of the elderly, poor, disabled, and sick, forced relocation of people to unsafe areas with limited economic opportunity, lack of safety in areas of displacement, return or resettlement, and inequities in addressing employment, property, and compensation questions. Linking climate change and displacement. There are major methodological challenges involved in establishing the link between climate change and displacement. People leave their homes for a complex set of reasons, and there is multi-causality even in forced migration. Nevertheless, while examining some of the current and predicted effects of climate change, a number of researchers and international institutions have arrived at the conclusion that climate change will probably contribute to major forced displacements over time. One major impact of climate change is the increased frequency and severity of certain hazards, as well as changes in their time frame and location. Hazards can combine with human vulnerability to produce disasters such as floods and droughts. In other words, there is a crucial human element involved in the occurrence of natural disasters. We can call them climate-related disasters since climate change can influence their frequency, severity, time, and location. Storms, floods, and droughts all belong to this category. All natural disasters can potentially result in forced displacement. The number of recorded natural disasters has doubled from approximately 200 to over 400 per year over the past 2 decades. The majority are climate related disasters. According to the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, the situation of more frequent and severe disasters may be the new normal, although there is a broad acceptance that voluntary and forced migration is likely to increase as a consequence of climate change. It is difficult to estimate the scale. In 2009, OCHA worked with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center of the NRC in a first attempt to assess the degree of displacement due to sudden onset of natural disasters. They found that as many as 36 million people had been displaced by such disasters in the year 2008, over 20 million by climate related sudden onset disasters alone. Estimating displacement due to slow onset disasters such as drought and sea level rise is much more challenging because it has a more complex set of causes and because there is a continuum between voluntary and forced migration. Nevertheless, the numbers quoted above give an indication of the scale of displacement caused by climate related disasters today. While offering its own estimate, the Stern Review points out that the number of displaced people will depend on the level of investment, planning and resources. In the near future at least, displacement is likely to go on being mostly internal and in some cases regional. All countries will eventually be affected by climate change, but some are more immediately and directly exposed than others. In its report, the IPCC highlights dangers associated with Arctic Africa, small islands and the Asian and African megadeltas, while recognizing that within other areas, even those with higher incomes, some people such as poor, young children and the elderly can be particularly at risk, and also some areas and some activities much sudden onset natural disaster induced displacement is temporary if there is effective rehabilitation and recovery, but some displacement become permanent. This research on climate change, disasters and displacement raises central questions about the need to protect displaced individuals and entire populations. The protection needs of people displaced by natural disasters have not yet been fully explored and understood. However, one of the main ideas behind the 1998 UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement was that, regardless of the reason of displacement, the people concerned often have a particular set of needs. While recognizing that much work is needed to identify protection needs, we therefore feel justified in examining more generally the current protection regime, identifying gaps and looking at the possible solution for filling those gaps in the context of climate change. Filling the gap in cross-border displacement caused by natural disaster, amending the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, since many of the people displaced across borders do not qualify as either stateless persons or refugees. Some advocates for their protection have suggested amending the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. This might seem like the most straightforward way of dealing with the cross-border protection gaps and a solution that would have the advantage of securing rights within a well-recognized and established legal instrument. However, critics including the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that is UNHCR, and NRC have pointed out that any initiative to amend the refugee definition as agreed in 1951 Convention would involve the risk of a full renegotiation of the Convention. In the current political climate, any renegotiations could undermine the international refugee protection regime altogether. Seeking to expand the definition of a refugee, no matter how pure the expander's intentions, could result in less protection for those who find refuge through today's convention. Any such weakening should be avoided. Therefore, other options must be explored. Moreover, concepts and mechanisms set out in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, such as persecution concept and the idea that refugee status substitutes for protection from home states, may not be suitable in the context of climate change and natural disaster. Inclusion in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change or other climate agreement. The 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change UNFCCC provides the common international framework within which to address the causes and consequences of climate change. The current 1997 Kyoto Protocol commitments run until 2012 and states are still negotiating what should come after that. While the Kyoto Protocol focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that is climate change mitigation, a successor agreement is also supposed to address the consequences of climate change that can no longer be avoided, that is climate change adaptation. Clearly, a climate change agreement could be crucial to preventing disasters and displacement, including displacement resulting from climate measures. In terms of protection during displacement, the UNFCCC process has less to offer. Historically, it has had little focus on remedies and there has been a reluctance to incorporate human rights issues. However, a climate change agreement could also play a certain role in protecting people who are migrating or have been displaced. Activities related to migration and displacement qualify for funding in latest draft texts. Nevertheless, while it is important to recognize migration and displacement and to ensure funding and cooperation, it is unlikely that we will find a full solution here. Creating a new convention. Several authors argue that the protection gaps would be best filled by creating a new international convention. Hodgkinson, Burton, Young and Anderson argue that neither the UNFCCC nor current human rights and refugee protection instruments are appropriate for dealing with the issue. For the operation and application of a new climate change displacement convention, the authors stress the need to prove that climate change causes the displacement in question. They emphasize that although the new treaty should include people displaced by a sudden onset of a climatic event, current science is unable to attribute a sudden climatic event directly to climate change, and that applying complex analysis to sudden onset disasters could hamper relief operations and programs. A new instrument would therefore, according to the authors, more readily apply to the slow onset disasters than to sudden onset disasters. However, displacement caused by slow onset disaster is often more complex than that of sudden onset disasters, thereby further complicating causality. The possible lengthiness of determining the cause means that there would be a risk of the people displaced spending long periods with their protection needs unaddressed. Bonnie Dougherty and Tyler Gianni have suggested a similar comprehensive instrument that would stipulate guarantees of assistance, shared responsibility between host and home state, and the right to protection and humanitarian aid. The definition of climate change refugee applied by Dougherty and Giannini encompasses both slow and sudden onset disasters. The instrument would allow the determination of refugee status on a group basis while still allowing individual claims. This is because climate change affects entire communities and group determination is cost efficient. ensures equal application and avoids repeated debate over the cause of an event. In addition to establishing causality, a major challenge is the probable lack of political will today to establish a comprehensive framework with strong and clear rights for the displaced. Moreover, the way that the existing international architecture is currently functioning raises questions about how effective it would be to add new institutions to it. Securing protection for just those displaced by climate related disasters while excluding people displaced by other natural disasters also seem hard to justify. Context oriented and dynamic interpretation of existing human rights law. A partial solution to the normative protection gap may be found in the broader human rights law, pondering the possibility, permissibility, and reasonableness of return. We may see cases where a person's return to his or her place of origin at some point becomes impossible owing to climate change and or disaster. The island states may be an extreme example. In other cases, disasters are likely to affect infrastructure which may be necessary for a return. Forced return may also not be allowable because it is considered to breach a fundamental right. In human rights law, non-refoulement is an absolute and general ban on sending a person independent of conduct or status to places where they risk certain rights violation. Most agree that the prohibition of torture is a peremptory norm, but there is disagreement regarding the extent to which one is protected by customary law against ill treatment and other human rights violation. No matter the degree to which a disaster has been created by humans, it is doubtful, to say the least, that it can meet the international definition of torture as the infliction of severe pain or other suffering by a public official for one of the purposes listed in the torture conventions, such as punishment or obtaining a confession. It could also seem far-fetched to call a disaster cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. In some cases, rather than claiming that an asylum seeker forced to return to his or her country of origin is being returned to the infliction of ill treatment, the return itself could arguably constitute ill treatment, perhaps even torture. Let us illustrate this with an example. How should we consider a case where a public official leaves a person to fend for himself with hardly any means in the middle of a desert? Generally, courts have carefully circumscribed the meaning of inhuman or degrading treatment, but there are cases where the concept of inhuman treatment has been interpreted rather progressively. In a case in the United Kingdom, the European Court of Human Rights considered that returning an HIV infected person to St. Kitts would amount to inhuman treatment owing, among other things, to the lack of sufficient medical treatment, a social network, a home, or any prospect of making a living. During and after disasters such as Hurricane Mitch, Central America 1998, and Cyclone Nargis, Myanmar 2008, both people's home and vital infrastructure were destroyed or damaged, which hindered the provision of basic essentials such as clean water, electricity, and food. One could consider that people with particular vulnerabilities are protected against having to return to such circumstances. Clearly, law relating to the permissibility of return is relevant in a climate change context. Choosing a combination of solutions explored above may prove the most effective way of filling the protection gaps. This complex issue needs to be dealt with in several forums and at several levels. Climate change is a global process that is influencing the occurrence of natural disasters. The resulting international responsibility needs to be reflected in the financing of protection for the people affected by that change. This can be dealt with most appropriately in a new global climate change agreement based on principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and other principles of environmental law. Funding would enable countries to deal better with displacement, most of which is likely to go on being internal and regional in the developing countries. It is also important to encourage further international and regional cooperation, particularly regarding cross-border displacement. It is therefore crucial to keep the reference to the migration and displacement in the adaptation text being negotiated under the UNFCCC. From a human security and protection perspective, however, there is no basic compelling reason to distinguish between climate-related and other natural disasters. Specific law and protection should apply to all those displaced by natural disaster. The human rights regime, the non-refoulement principle and complementary protection mechanisms can provide building blocks for a new ways of affording protection, particularly regarding the concept of return. If return is not possible, permissible or reasonable owing to the circumstances in the place of origin and to personal conditions, a person should receive protection and a clear status. Linking return to a wider human rights has the advantage of being open to dynamic interpretations, but it also allows for discretion. An explicit reference to the natural disasters or similar phenomena such as in Finnish law may be necessary, particularly considering the ever-shifting sentiments towards migrants and asylum seekers. The focus on return rather than the cause and impact of the initial movement may get us around some of the challenges of slow onset disasters, including the voluntary forced continuum. A more permanent protection status would be necessary in some cases in addition to the temporary protection. Thank you so much for watching.